Last time on the Lost Relics, we followed a scroll made of copper, a treasure list hammered into metal, 64 hiding places, tons of gold and silver, and not one cache ever found. But there's a detail we left in the shadows. The copper scroll was not found alone. It came out of a cave above the Dead Sea, one cave among 11. And those caves were keeping something stranger than treasure. They were keeping a library, nearly 1,000 manuscripts, sealed in clay jars, hidden in desert cliffs, and then abandoned for almost 2,000 years. Someone carried an entire library into the wilderness, hid it with extraordinary care, and no one ever came back for it. This is the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the story of who has been hunting them ever since. It begins not with a scholar, but with a goat. In the winter of 1946 into 47, a young Bedouin shepherd of the Ta'amira tribe, his name was Mohammed edh-dhib, the wolf, was searching the cliffs near a ruin called Qumran on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, the lowest place on the face of the earth. One of his animals had wandered, and in the way these stories so often begin, he threw a stone into the dark mouth of a cave. Years later, he described that moment in his own words. "Every time I threw a rock," he said, "I heard the sound of breaking pottery." Inside, standing in the gloom, were tall clay jars, and inside the jars, bundles of leather wrapped in linen, brittle with age. He could not read them. Almost no one alive could. He had just made what many call the greatest manuscript discovery of the 20th century. What happened next is not a museum story. It's a bazaar story. The scrolls traveled by donkey to Bethlehem, to a cobbler and part-time antiquities dealer named Khalil Iskander Shahin. Everyone called him Kando. 3 of the scrolls changed hands for about 7 Jordanian pounds, a few dollars, for manuscripts 1,000 years older than almost any Bible on earth. 4 scrolls reached Mar Athanasius Samuel, Archbishop of a Syrian Orthodox monastery in Jerusalem. The other 3 found their way to an archaeologist at the Hebrew University, Eliezer Sukenik, who examined them by lamplight in November of 1947, as the land around him broke into war. He bought them anyway. He wrote in his diary that his hands shook, because what was written on that leather changed everything. One scroll was the complete book of Isaiah, every chapter, every line, copied more than a century before the birth of Jesus. Until that moment, the oldest surviving Hebrew Bibles dated from the Middle Ages. Suddenly, scholars were reading scripture 1,000 years closer to the source. And alongside the Bible came books no one had ever seen, the rulebook of a secretive community, hymns, calendars that defied the temple's own, and a battle plan for the end of the world, a war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. This wasn't just a library. It was the voice of a vanished world. So the hunt began, Bedouin and archaeologists racing each other across the cliffs, cave by cave. In 1952, it became an avalanche. Cave 3 held the copper scroll, the treasure list we followed in our last episode, the strangest document of them all. And then came Cave 4, a man-made hollow in the marl cliff directly opposite the Qumran ruin. It held the remains of some 500 to 600 manuscripts, torn, crumbled, trampled by time into roughly 15,000 fragments, the largest jigsaw puzzle in archaeology, and most of the pieces missing. By 1956, 11 caves had yielded nearly 1,000 manuscripts. Almost every book of the Hebrew Bible was there, all of it older than anything the world had ever read. And then the story took a turn no novelist would dare. On the 1st of June, 1954, a classified ad appeared in the Wall Street Journal between listings for steel tanks and office space. It read, "The 4 Dead Sea Scrolls, biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 200 BC, are for sale. This would be an ideal gift to an educational or religious institution." The Archbishop Mar Samuel had carried his scrolls to America and found no buyer. The man who answered the ad, through a carefully anonymous middleman, was Yigael Yadin, soldier, archaeologist, and the son of Eliezer Sukenik, the professor whose hands had trembled in 47. The price was $250,000. Father and son, 7 years apart, had reunited the 7 scrolls of Cave 1. Today, they rest in Jerusalem, in a museum built like the lid of one of those clay jars, the Shrine of the Book. But the deepest mystery was never where the scrolls would end up. It's who hid them in the first place. In the ruins of Qumran, excavators found ritual baths, a room some call a writing hall, inkwells, and a cemetery of more than 1,000 graves. The leading theory says this was the home of the Essenes, a separatist Jewish brotherhood described by ancient writers, Josephus, Philo, and Pliny the Elder, who placed them on this very shore. The community's own rulebook seems to echo their way of life, down to the shared meals and the oaths. But the theory has serious challenges. Some scholars argue the scrolls never belonged to Qumran at all, that they were libraries smuggled out of Jerusalem, one step ahead of the Roman army. Others see a breakaway priestly faction. The honest answer, scholars admit, is that no scroll ever names its authors. The library speaks. The librarians stay silent. What we do know is why it ended. In the year 66, Judea rose against Rome, and Rome answered with annihilation. As the legions swept toward Jerusalem, someone climbed these cliffs with jar after jar, sealing away a civilization's memory. The settlement at Qumran burned around the year 68. The temple fell 2 years later. And whoever hid the library never came back. They left a message they didn't intend. History's proof that you can save the words, even when you cannot save the world. The desert kept the secret well, and it may be keeping more. In 2017, archaeologists identified a 12th cave, its jars torn open, a rusted pickaxe left behind. Someone had beaten them to it. As recently as 2021, new fragments surfaced from a place called the Cave of Horror. The cliffs are not finished talking, and the scrolls have never stopped making history or trouble. For almost 40 years, a tiny circle of editors held exclusive rights to the unpublished fragments, while the world waited. The deadlock broke only in 1991, when a California library defied the embargo and threw open its photographs, a moment hailed as a triumph of intellectual freedom. Then came the con. After 2002, new fragments began surfacing on the market, selling for millions. In 2020, investigators delivered a stunning verdict. All 16 fragments owned by a major museum in Washington were modern forgeries: old leather, amber glue, and nerve. Some of the world's best experts had been fooled, and the science still isn't settled. Just last year, researchers paired new radiocarbon tests with artificial intelligence trained to read ancient handwriting, and concluded that many scrolls are even older than we believed. 2,000 years on, the library is still rewriting its own story. But before we close this case, there is one more thread, and it leads somewhere we've been before. 1,000 years after the scrolls were hidden, in the year 1119, 9 French knights rode into a conquered Jerusalem. They were granted quarters on the Temple Mount itself, in a hall the Crusaders called the Temple of Solomon. From that address, they took a name you already know, the Knights Templar. The records say they were 9 men, sworn to guard pilgrims on the roads. The legend says 9 knights guarded nothing, and spent 9 years digging beneath the temple, beneath the very treasury the copper scroll describes. Centuries later, engineers mapping the tunnels under the mount found passages, and Crusader relics resting in the dark. What did the Templars find down there? History records nothing, but within 2 centuries they had become the richest order in Christendom, and on a single Friday morning in 1307, all of it vanished. Next time on the Lost Relics, the knights, the tunnels, and the treasure that disappeared twice. Subscribe. The dig has already begun.